Friends and listeners, today we have another deep dive. And this one is in a really hot topic within the startup ecosystem, within Silicon Valley, within the world at large, which is marketplace businesses, which have become Airbnb, Uber as examples in the last decade. Some of the biggest businesses in the world, and certainly the latest trend in the startup ecosystem from investors, from founders, is towards building marketplace businesses. And yet, so little is written, discussed, researched, talked about when it comes to how to build marketplace businesses. So after spending 7 years at Airbnb, Lenny Rachitsky not only took his experience from Airbnb and has been advising marketplaces around the world, he took that experience and had conversations with dozens of other people from 17 of the biggest marketplaces out there and consolidated all of that research into what has just dropped this week, which is about a 50-page, amazing deep dive, written deep dive into what makes these marketplace businesses tick. This is the audio complement to that. And I was really excited to ask Lenny if he'd be down to give an audio complement, a podcast complement to what dropped this week. And he was amenable to it. Really thankful, especially because the day before we recorded this, which we recorded this last week, the day before, I got a tweet from Jax Vollings, who said, "Can someone interview Lenny's Twitter handle, on a podcast? I've loved the newsletter so much. I know it'll be fire." And Jax added me to the tweet. So Jax, this is for you and countless other people that want to understand a little bit more or a lot bit more about marketplace businesses. For listeners that like these deep dive episodes that we're dropping every few weeks on specific topics that we go super deep on, please leave us a review, rate it in your favorite podcast app, leave a review. This is what helps the podcast apps know which episodes and which podcasts to feature. And we read and love every review that we get, especially the 5-star ones. And it's one of the biggest ways that you can support us. So if you can take 5 seconds to drop in a rating, we would really appreciate it. Before we start the show, take a moment to imagine this. Your smartest friend, 18 months from now, travels back in time to today, goes back 18 months to today from the future, and they tell you what is about to happen. They tell you the hottest trends when it comes to startups, when it comes to businesses, when it comes to opportunities to place bets on. That would be pretty nice, right? Well, you don't have to dream it because that exists. It's called Trends, and it's a new publication from The Hustle, the folks with one of the biggest business and tech newsletters in the world with over 1 million subscribers. They've enlisted a team of market researchers, journalists, entrepreneurs, a bunch of people to spot the next big opportunities in business today. Every week, subscribers get a newsletter loaded with the latest on opportunities ready to explode, startups on the rise, and even actionable details on how you can capitalize on those opportunities. It's like a weekly playbook on the hottest startup opportunities you haven't heard of. Go see what I'm talking about at trends.co/BTL. That's trends.co/BTL for below the line. There you can sign up for 2 weeks of unlimited access for just $1. You'll get the newsletter, access to their private members only forum. Check it out, see if it's the right thing for you. Their private members only website, case studies, everything for just $1. Again, it's trends.co/BTL. All right, without further delay, let's get into it with Lenny Rachitsky. This is Below the Line. And we're live. Leonard, cheers.
Thanks, James.
We've got some matcha kari, premium, ceremonial, first harvest. Add every superlative to this because this is my favorite matcha. It's matcha kari, matcha.com. Thank you, Matcha Kari, for sending this. They sent boxes of this to me. That team is really awesome. So thank you.
How do I get on that?
I guess start a podcast and talk about random drinks a bunch.
Okay, great.
That helps.
I'm going to do that.
It's specifically matcha. I talk about matcha a bunch. Let's take a sip, and then we're going to get started in something I'm super pumped to talk about that I think does not get discussed. I've never heard a podcast on it, so I'm pretty pumped.
Can I ask you a question about your drink choices?
Yes, for sure.
Do you have is it like a Seinfeld comedian in cars getting coffee situation where you match the drink to the person?
That is a funny question. I don't know if it's a good one, but it's a funny one to think about. No, I do not match them to people. But I guess maybe on some level it is similar to comedians in cars getting coffee in that I do think sharing a drink, all right, I'll give you the real below the line
great.
version on the drink.
Getting
One,
into it.
I think a different kind of strange drink beyond just coffee is well, ties to my book Beyond Coffee, but is just a little more fun than just, all right, we're going to have a deep conversation. It's introducing some levity up at the top of the hour, and every episode has a pretty different quirky drink. That was the first thought. The second thought is that act of clinking our glasses synchronizes, I think, on a psychological level,
holy shit,
synchronizes me and the guest in some form or fashion. I think it's probably why it's such a tradition everywhere you go around the globe. But I think that is one of the biggest reasons that I want to do it, is to have that moment to kick off the podcast. So I've never said that out loud, but that's below the line. That's what's happening in my head when I say, we're live and cheers.
Great. We're getting deep immediately.
We are, at least on the weird aspect of the podcast of having a drink.
Yeah.
And then, I love investing in the space. As you know, I love investing in direct-to-consumer and consumer product goods companies that many of them are beverages. So I just have a bunch of random drinks in the house, or I'm looking at some random oat milk company one day that's sending me stuff. Shout out to Muwala. Or it's my preference for matcha over coffee. So trying every matcha brand or matcha canned drinks. And so I guess that's also part of it. I have a bunch of random drinks lying around.
Yeah.
But enough about the drinks.
Okay.
Let's talk about you real quick.
Okay.
And I would love for folks to get not just background on you, but background on why marketplace businesses, so, below the line, is always observing what's really going on. Sometimes it's on specific guests and in the psychology of creation, or what's happening beneath the surface for them as creators or leaders. And then every once in a while, I'll have these deep dive episodes like this one right now, where we go on a deep dive, following the metaphor of the iceberg, to dissecting a topic that doesn't get dissected enough, or people have a surface level understanding. You and I probably had surface level understanding of when we'd see like the words marketplace next to a business, or why investors were looking at marketplaces. And in and of themselves, it's just a euphemism for, value will be created there, but not really understanding why. And now with you, 7 years of working at Airbnb, and even more so with all of the insights and research you've taken away over the last several months, diving super deep, way deeper than this podcast will go, into marketplaces. Like I said right in the beginning, I've never heard a podcast on marketplaces. They dominate so much of thinking and in the technology space. So I'm really pumped for this. So right before we get to your background, what was the impetus behind you wanting to say, all right, I will roll up my sleeves and be the person that's going to write 50 pages dissecting marketplace businesses?
Yeah. So I spent 7 years at Airbnb, and I left about 8 months ago. And I found a lot of people reaching out to me asking about, hey, what did you guys do right? What should we do for our marketplace? How do we grow? What did they do? And I was, sharing advice and wisdom, because I worked on growth at Airbnb and a lot of other things.
And we worked together there. I still remember the first day I met you.
In the Bear Cave?
No, it was actually outside of T-Roll conference room. And we sat down on one of those green little blocks. And I said, after our conversation, I don't know if you remember this, but I remember after our conversation just asking you, do you meditate? Because you had a very, very chill, very chill vibe, and a very pacifying vibe that I hope listeners can get a sense of that during this podcast, because it is it was really great, especially one of my first few days at Airbnb at 5,000 people. I really remembered our first interaction where I was like, man, I'm going to be friends with this guy.
That's sweet.
Yeah.
This is above the line.
Yeah, that is. Below the line is you're a piece of shit. Then once I got to know you, I realized you're a true piece of work.
We're going to cut this part.
Yeah, no, we're keeping this in. People need to know the below the line version on you.
Yeah, I know.
No, I'm just kidding.
Finally,
exactly.
Word is out.
All right. So 7 years at Airbnb.
7 years at Airbnb. And so, I started giving advice to companies, startups about how to grow marketplaces. And I had this feeling that all I'm just sharing is this one perspective on Airbnb, which just happens to be one company that worked out. And so through that, I've been very eager to figure out what worked for other folks, what worked for other bigger marketplaces that worked out really well.
And what are some of the bigger marketplaces that came to mind right when you were like, I wonder what XYZ did?
Yeah, like, Uber, Lyft, Thumbtack, DoorDash, Caviar, Etsy, TaskRabbit, OpenTable, Eventbrite.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just had this feeling like, hey, I want to know what they did, partly so that I can give better answers to people that are reaching out to me, partly so that I can just learn what other folks did. And so I started talking to people at other companies, just intellectually, just curious. Hey, what did you guys do? How did you crack the chicken and egg problem? How did you manage quality in the marketplace? How did you grow supply? How did you grow demand? And
we'll get into all of that. By the way, for folks.
We'll talk through all of the learnings of all of these companies. And so I started initially just talking through these things with folks, and then I started writing them down. And then I realized, hey, maybe I should just do a research project almost, where I interview early growth people at every marketplace company that actually drove growth or are very close to that, and share what worked for them.
And I'll say for listeners, well, you do have an amazing newsletter, but also your Twitter account is very insightful. And in this project, is this one of the larger research projects that you took on? Well, you're creating some great content out there, and
thanks, James.
I'm really excited for this to come out because it'll be your magnum opus to date, but it's certainly, there's so much to learn from following your newsletter or following you on Twitter outside of this.
Thanks, James. Yeah, so I printed out this whole thing that I'm going to be releasing over a series of weeks because it's way too much content.
Good God. So that's not a normal paperclip. You had to get one of those industrial paperclips for it too.
A clip. It's like a fancy clip thing.
Well, I'm glad we're going to have this audio component, complement to the actual written stuff, because that looks dense.
Yeah. So I started talking to these folks. I started recording them, writing down, just basically I turned into a reporter, which I didn't expect, where I had to start reaching out to folks, capture their learnings, synthesize them, figure out what's useful, quote them, and essentially turn that into a story. And essentially what it turned into is a playbook of how to build a marketplace business, to kickstart and scale it. So I ended up talking to about 20-something people across 17 of the biggest marketplaces in the world. And that's what this kind of turned into.
Well, that's awesome. Well, what are some of the things that we should cover as caveats or prefaces before we jump in?
Yeah, great question. So one, I just want to thank everybody that contributed to this thing. Basically, this is just a collection of all of their genius and experience and learnings, and I just kind of took it and formed it into a story. And so this would be nothing without all the folks that I talked to. There's probably 25 people that I'm not going to name because that's going to be boring, but it's going to be in the newsletter that I sent out, and I'll continue recognizing all these folks that contributed to this thing. But let me kind of run through maybe just all the companies that are part of this thing, just to kind of put that in people's minds.
Please.
And then I'll go through a couple more caveats. So the companies that I talked to are Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Thumbtack, Etsy, AngelList, Instacart, Caviar, OpenTable, Eventbrite, TaskRabbit, Grubhub, Breather, Patreon, Rover, Zillow, and of course, Airbnb.
Whoa. That's quite a list. All right. So I'm guessing this is going to be, and I'm not guessing, I know this is the most comprehensive dive into marketplace businesses that I've ever seen. Had you seen anything like this before around marketplaces that you used as maybe a reference resource from years ago that you wanted to update? Or is this kind of something you're like, this just needs to exist?
I wish this existed, because then I wouldn't have had to do this.
Yeah.
that's why I did this. I just felt like nothing comprehensive like this existed. And I just felt like I had to be the change I want to see in the world and just start doing it. And I think I had the advantage of I had a nice network through Airbnb and through, Twitter, and this newsletters kind of turned into an interesting network. And then a lot of the people that I knew were able to connect me to other folks. And so that was awesome. And so double thanks to those folks that helped me connect to a bunch of people, like, guys like Casey Winters connecting me to a lot of people, Mike DeBowie, Greylock, a few other folks.
He used to work at Tilt, and Mike is the man. He is former colleague, and he is the man. Real quick, before we dive into the other caveats, how would you define marketplaces?
So I could find a great definition. So I kind of came up with one, and I think it feels right. It feels like there's three parts of what makes a marketplace business. One is it connects demand, which is basically people that want a thing, to supply, which is people or businesses that have that thing. And three, it leads to a transaction between those two parties. So we talked through, I listed a bunch of the marketplace companies as examples: Airbnb, Etsy, DoorDash, Uber, Lyft. Maybe examples of not marketplace companies. There's like the obvious ones, like let's say Delta Airline. They're not a marketplace because they own the supply. They're not connecting you to some other company that has planes. Mm-hmm. Google, not a marketplace. There's no financial transaction. That's, I think, a reason they disqualify. Mm-hmm. And then I don't know, like banks. There's no supply. It's like a bank. You go to the bank, you give your money. So those are not
a conduit to someone else's supply, taking a transaction. And what was the third aspect?
Supply, demand, and the transaction. So that it's essentially a platform that efficiently connects and aggregates supply and demand and helps them find each other and have a transaction. Mm-hmm. So that's the way I think about it.
Are there any things that came close to being marketplaces, but then ultimately you would say, or the company would say, we thought it was, but it's not?
Yeah. So, and that's where some of the most interesting things are. So we can get into this later, but so Patreon is a really good example. Turns out they thought they were a marketplace. A lot of people think they're a marketplace company. Patreon allows creators to charge to kind of patronize them, to give them money every month to support their art. And I think
newsletter, or music video, or podcast, we'll put a profile up there. And I remember early on the value prop was you're going to find new listeners to your podcast that will support you. And you're saying it's not a marketplace. And
that's the learning they shared with me. And it turns out that was one of the most important realizations they had as a company, that we're actually not a marketplace. We should be the best SaaS tool for creators to make a living and do their thing. And once they realized that, they were able to cut the entire demand side of their roadmap, what they call discovery, and concentrate on becoming the best platform for creators. So the way they think about themselves now is to become kind of the Shopify of creators. And an interesting nuance there is when they thought they were a marketplace, they had this interesting misalignment of incentives between the creator and the patron, because at some point, they call it the graduation problem. You get big enough where you don't need the marketplace anymore because people know of you and you could just go and collect money on your own without kind of the fees in the way. And so if you're trying to create a marketplace, you want those people on the platform because then they funnel to other smaller creators. Mm-hmm. And so it creates this misalignment of incentives where Patreon isn't trying to drive all of the traffic they can to that one creator. And once they got rid of that part and decided they're just a cool SaaS tool, then they're completely aligned again.
What is the internal desire to be a marketplace? Where does that come from? And do you feel like that leads to a lot of companies wanting to be a marketplace and potentially foregoing a large opportunity of being a SaaS business? And maybe even just backing up, if you could theoretically, or if you could hypothetically in an ideal world choose between a marketplace and SaaS business, knowing everything you know, which one would you choose and why? And maybe that'll help answer why founders early on also try to go after the marketplace.
Yeah. So excellent questions. So let me talk about why I think marketplace businesses are so appealing and why I think two of the top 10 biggest companies in the world are marketplace companies. So the five reasons.
Which are?
Amazon, they're sort of a marketplace. They're initially an e-commerce site where they think they own they bought inventory and they sold it, but they've moved into a marketplace. And then Alibaba.
Okay.
So the 5 reasons I think they're great businesses, why people want to get into them. One is they have network effects, which is another word for as you add more users, it becomes more useful to all of the users, which then drives more users. So
right, which is network effects for listeners that aren't too familiar with them. It's one of the most desirable moats and defensible positions to have, where more customers make the product better. My Nike shoes do not get better because a million more people are wearing them. It's actually freakishly anomalous for a product or service to get better because a million more people are using it, like Airbnb or like Facebook. And that network effect then becomes very desirable, even from a smart, early, savvy point of view, for founders to say, man, it'd be really great if we could have a business that has this type of defensibility built in. Yeah.
And Airbnb is a good example because it has this interesting geographic network effect where you need critical mass. Both, say I want to go to Paris. It needs to have traction in San Francisco where I am. I have to know about it and want to use it. And it needs to have traction in Paris to have enough supply. So it's this very network effect almost, which is extremely hard to dislodge and to replicate.
Well, and this is a below the line observation that maybe I've heard 1 or 2 people express, but it's not a pervasive observation, but my guess is that many businesses that had network effects or marketplaces didn't set out saying this needs to be a network affected business. And my examples that I think about is, I don't think Brian, Joe, and Nate knew what a network effect was. When you're shaking your head,
probably,
you were there much longer than I was.
I think you're totally right.
I don't think Mark Zuckerberg knew what a network effect with Facebook was, because even when they were at 50, 60,000 users at Facebook, they were trying to build a parallel business called Wirehog, which was a file sharing business that is similar to Dropbox, that doesn't have network effects. Very, very weak form network effects. Anyway.
Yeah, and it's not even the founders. Like for 3 years, nobody wanted to fund them. And no one believed in Airbnb. Right. And so I think there wasn't even a sense of the power of the network effect early on.
When did marketplaces become in vogue in the Valley, from your perspective?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a good answer.
I know that when I got out here 7 years ago, it was not. 8 years ago, it was not the cool thing. It just was the term marketplace was barely thrown around.
Yeah.
And I feel like with the advent of Airbnb and Uber, it became more and more commonplace. But was your experience similar, or do you feel like it's always been a through line for smartest investors?
I think, like 7-8 years ago, Airbnb wasn't a juggernaut. And so I think to your point, it's like, oh wow, Airbnb is a successful company. What are the attributes of Airbnb? Oh, what are the attributes of Uber? Oh, interesting, marketplace. Maybe there's something there.
Yeah. I tied to it. Tilt was, you leveraged a lot of the plumbing from, and this whole conversation is going to give me PTSD. It's just going to bring up a lot of scar tissue of many things we got
below the line
with Tilt. Yeah. Or, 8 years ago, there were companies that came about just providing tools for 8 years ago, 7 years ago, 5 years ago, certainly tools for marketplaces. So that highlighted just how big this has become, the space where in the last few years, entire companies have been built just to provide help for marketplaces. Companies like Checker, companies like Clearbit. But okay, so let's dive in.
So let me run through these real quick. So network effects. So the reasons marketplaces are great. Network effects, which connects the barrier to entry. They have a strong barrier to entry. Replicating supply and demand is hard, and starting from zero. For example, OpenTable is a good example. Trying to dislodge OpenTable, where they have all these restaurants and all these people looking at OpenTable to book restaurants. Not easy to just kind of come out of nowhere and take that over. 3 is efficiency. They have no inventory, and so it's a lot cheaper and more efficient to operate. Airbnb is a great example of that. There's no hotels. They don't have to pay for real estate and managing all those things. 4, scalability.
And a stat to put that in perspective, I think Airbnb is launching the equivalent of a Hilton every 9 months. The Hilton network with
in terms of rooms available.
In terms of rooms, right?
Yeah.
And you wouldn't be able to do that if you had to have all of the physical
Yeah.
limitations that come with building out the rooms or bringing on cars in the case of Airbnb or in the case of Uber. It is just put that in perspective. Every 9 months, brand new Hilton-esque network of rooms is brought online with Airbnb, which is pretty phenomenal.
Nice job, Airbnb.
Yeah, props.
So for scalability, same kind of reasoning. Without inventory, you can scale out faster. Thumbtack is a good example. Instead of hiring 1 million plumbers, they connect you to plumbers that already exist. And they can scale nationally, internationally without having to hire 1 million plumbers.
Yeah.
And then 5, I'd say flexibility. You can pivot as a company and adjust business models and things like that a lot more quickly. For example, I think Uber, they started with black cars, limo drivers. They realized, oh, wow, there's a whole shared car opportunity. So they pivoted to that. They didn't have to sell, limos and cars and a whole suite of cars.
Do you mind relisting those 5 things?
Yeah. Network effects, barrier to entry, efficiency, scalability, and flexibility.
So 5 great things for why you would, from the ideation phase, focus on what are some marketplace opportunities.
Yeah. And so to your point you asked earlier, SaaS versus marketplace, something Casey Winter actually just wrote this week that I loved is there's this trend of SaaS companies trying to move into marketplaces because they have supply. They have a bunch of people using their SaaS tool. Hey, what if we could offer them demand to help drive their business? And so there's this desire of how do you latch on a marketplace onto your SaaS tool? And it's not easy.
What would be an example? That's interesting.
I guess, so Eventbrite, I think, is going through this a little bit right now. So Eventbrite started as a ticketing platform for creators and event creators. And then there's always this sense of, hey, we're going to also drive demand to your events. We're going to have people looking for things to do and they'll book your stuff and it'll be great. And that's always been an opportunity for them. And they're starting to lean into that more and more.
Interesting. Yeah, Amazon could be, not necessarily SaaS, but it was the e-commerce stack for many businesses. If you're, Chronicle Books, you would send the books and they would take care of your e-commerce side of the business. And then over time saying, let's open that up to anyone, borrow our infrastructure for the third-party marketplace.
That's a good point.
Okay. Keep going.
So let me go through a couple disclaimers and we're going to dive into this thing. 3 things. One is for a lot of these companies, we're going to talk about how they grew and how they scaled, how they cracked chicken and egg and all these things. But for a lot of these companies, the reason they succeeded is not because of some magical growth lever, but it's because they had amazing product market fit and they solved the problem really well.
That sounds really beautiful. What do you mean by that?
That like Airbnb, you look at it and you're like, okay, cool. Like they did X, Y, Z and they grew. And so if I do X, Y, Z, that's going to work out really well and I'm going to become a huge company. But in the end, a lot of what made Airbnb successful, and maybe most of it, is just it was a really amazing experience. It was a cheap way to travel. It was a local, unique place to stay in a city. And that's a lot of why Airbnb turned into Airbnb. And we'll get into this more, but you could see this in the amount of traffic they get. That's just word of mouth, people talking about it. And so that's one way to just measure how much of a product market fit your company has, just how much of it is just word of mouth, people telling each other about it.
And what would be the contrary approach or the approach that would get this really wrong?
Which part?
Well, you said nail that product market fit and then think about these growth levers. And I imagine the implication is, and you touched on a little bit with the Airbnb example of copying XYZ, but it only worked for Airbnb. Did you notice and have you noticed in the wider world of startups, many companies, I could presuppose an answer, but many companies just thinking about tactics and growth levers before product market fit?
Yeah, there's a survivorship bias to the companies I interviewed. And so I only focused on the biggest, most successful companies. I feel like there's a lot of learnings to be had of all the failed marketplaces and what they did that maybe is different from this group. But I'd say most companies fail because they don't have product market fit. They don't have a thing anybody wants. And so nothing they're going to do is really going to make it work.
I can offer my experience with Tilt in 30 seconds that it really was such an obsession around growth and a graph going up and to the right, and not enough around making sure that if this product went away or if there was a orthogonal competitor that was almost as good.
Yeah.
And we were to raise our prices, would people flee over to that competitor? And that absolutely happened with us and Venmo, as well as just focusing so much on a growth aspect to the company rather than, hey, let's make sure that this is intensely loved before we scale to multiple countries, multiple regions of the world. So that's 30 seconds to sum up many years of pain.
Yeah, like there's probably hours of content just about how to know if you have product market fit and how to avoid these common pitfalls.
I will call out Rahul from Superhuman has a great post on how to find and measure. I don't know if you agree with it, but how to measure and metrically see if you have product market fit that I'd recommend everyone to read and then implement if they can.
Yeah, based on Sean Ellis's survey question that I think he pioneered years back.
Right. Yes. Props to Sean Ellis and Rahul. But really take that, if you were wondering if you have product market fit, if you're in the business, you're listening to this podcast and you're wondering, okay, do people really love this? Is this ready for growth lovers? Check out that post.
Yeah. Okay. So disclaimer one.
Okay, I'm going to shut up.
There's so many tangents we can go on.
I know. I just love, and I love this topic so much, but I will shut up now as you go through this stuff.
Oh man. Okay. Well, okay. So disclaimer two. So we're going to be talking about what worked for companies in the past. As we know, past behavior is not predictive of future behavior. So my advice is look at this as an inspiration for how did people think about solving problems? How were they clever around figuring out new, levers or channels that maybe other people haven't done? But don't, look at this and be like, cool, this Thumbtack did X, Y, Z. I'm going to do exactly that. And it's going to work out exactly the same way. So just kind of take inspiration from this stuff. And then three, this is all based on interviews. So it's all anecdotal. Who knows what actually worked? I don't have the data to look at what actually worked at all of these companies. If memory's faulty, people may not know what actually worked in the end. And so there's probably stuff here that's not totally accurate. Maybe I got some stuff wrong, probably missed a couple things. I did my best to triangulate everything across multiple people and just kind of give it a sniff test. And it feels right. But I'm sure there's some stuff that's off here. So just don't kill me if I got something wrong.
So I will grant you that. Yeah. And I appreciate the disclaimer, but I have a feeling that this still is going to be quite illuminating.
I hope so.
All right.
So let me give you a high-level overview of what basically is a playbook that's emerged from all of these interviews that I've done.
All right.
So there's 3 phases to kickstarting and scaling a marketplace business. Okay, so let's start with phase 1, cracking the chicken and egg problem. So what the hell is the chicken and egg problem?
Mm-hmm.
So say you're trying to start a marketplace today. You got nothing. Say you're trying to start a DoorDash. And you're like, okay, I got to get restaurants on board. I got to get people to download my app, use my app, and look for restaurants. How do you do that? Do you get restaurants first? Do you get people downloading your app and looking for restaurants first? How do you convince restaurants to come on board before anybody cares and is going to order from them because they have to train the restaurant staff? They have to get them to install stuff in the restaurant.
Right.
And then on the demand side, how do you get anyone to use your app if there's like no restaurants or one restaurant in there? So that's classically called the chicken and egg problem. What comes first, chicken or egg?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's 4 steps that we're going to go through of how most of these marketplaces solve these problems.
Okay, awesome. Can't wait to dive into them.
And yeah.
But do you want to say phase 2, phase 3, and then we'll dive into each?
Oh yeah. So phase 2 is essentially scaling the marketplace once you've cracked the chicken and egg problem. And then phase 3 is evolving the marketplace. Once you have a successful business and you've scaled it, you often want to keep growing. And there's a few ways to keep growing. One is you want to, or what actually happens with a lot of marketplaces, you move into a managed marketplace. It's kind of a common trend now. 2, you often want to, or folks often add a new business line to their marketplace, building on top of a success they already have. So Uber Eats is an example.
Right.
Airbnb Experience is an example.
Man, so many questions. Okay.
So much to talk about.
So where do you want to start?
Yeah, so let's dive into phase 1,
Okay.
cracking the chicken and egg problem.
All right.
So there's 4 steps. I'll just name them real quick and then we're going to talk about what they are. Constrain, pick which side to concentrate on, drive supply, drive demand.
Okay.
So let's talk about constraining the marketplace. So a major learning from this research is that with the exception of one marketplace, which is itself instructive in a good story, every marketplace starts by constraining themselves, by creating a small market where they can figure out how to do what they're doing and get critical mass on both sides.
What is a great example of that? And then I'm curious what the exception is.
So there's two types of constraints. There's geographic constraints, and then there's category constraints. So geographic constraints are one city, for example. So an example there is Rover. So a quote from David Rosenthal at Rover. We started in Seattle and stayed hyper-focused on Seattle for a while. Seattle was the perfect market for us. Very dog-friendly, early adopters, techie, working professionals who go on vacation and business trips. Plus Amazon is super dog-friendly, which is in Seattle. And there's probably no more dog-friendly city in America. And this helped them figure out the product quickly in a small space.
Very cool. And then what would be the exception that you mentioned?
So the exception is Thumbtack. And there's a really great quote from one of their co-founders, Sander Daniels, of why they'd had to do this. The conventional wisdom was to narrow focus to a category like Amazon did with books, or geography like Yelp did with San Francisco. We didn't get funding for many years because we did the opposite. We did all categories and all geographies from the beginning. People thought that it wouldn't work, that we were boiling the ocean. In retrospect, it was the only way to build a marketplace in our space at scale. Being broad in category increased the frequency of use of our product from once every couple of years. How often do you need a house painter? To 8 to 12 times a year. And then being broad in geography allowed them to scale their marketplace as fast as possible, giving them revenue traffic and experimental velocity to learn what's working.
Interesting concept. What do you remember what his explanation of experimental velocity?
I think it's just amount of traffic. It gives you a lot more sample data where you can run experiments and see what's working.
It's a really interesting term. I haven't heard that before, but it's so true. It's experimental velocity, just having enough germs in the petri dish is needed to see what is going to happen if you try different levers. That's interesting.
Yeah, so I think that's a really instructive example of everybody constrains their marketplace, but there's an exception. And if you're the exception, it's fine, do that, but it's extremely hard. And so Thumbtack took them a long time to build up enough critical mass across the nation, across every category and across every city. But according to Sander, basically it was the only way they could have done it.
Mm-hmm. And of the other 16, was that the only one that didn't have one of these very quick soundbite constraints?
Yeah. So geo was one, category was the other. So and it's really simple. If you are a local marketplace where supply and demand have to interact physically, you constrain geographically. You pick a market or two. If not, then you constrain by category. So it's a really simple formula.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple examples of by category are Eventbrite and Etsy. So Eventbrite focused on tech events and conferences. So they just went deep and we're going to create ticketing and focus on ticketing for conferences and big events. And Etsy focused on vintage items, craft supplies, and handmade items. And what's interesting is they stayed like that. So that's sometimes that initial category that you constrain to becomes your differentiator as a company.
What is the navigation towards this constraint? Like if you could, maybe it's through the research or through your experience, what is that like? Is it just whiteboarding and coming up with, hey, these are going to be the constraints that we start with? Or do you think it's plant 1,000 flowers, see what blooms, and then zero in on that constraint?
So I think it's actually extremely straightforward. There's two options, geographic or category. And if you're a place where people have to meet in the real world, then it's geography and you start with a couple markets or one market. And if not, it's category. Unless you're this one, rare example where people just aren't using it enough for it to ever create critical mass. So I think that's the general formula.
Really? Yeah. I think with Eventbrite, from my understanding, is they did try to boil the ocean, try to go after all ticketing and quite a really random variation of different buckets, including colleges and events in colleges, before realizing, man, the tech adoption is so strong, and realizing, okay, let's focus all of our energy around that. But maybe that could be one of the other exceptions versus just saying, hey, it's really simple. We're just going to focus on this category and not go outside it.
Yeah, TaskRabbit, I think, is very similar. They, I think, probably started with too much broadness, and then they focused back in on like IKEA furniture. And I think that's when they started taking off. So I think even if they didn't get it right the first time, I think the learning from a lot of these is this is where you should go, or you should have been there.
and find constraint.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool.
And it feels counterintuitive. You're like, I want to build a big company. I want to go everywhere. We want to dog walkers in every city. Why would we not do that? And it turns out that's a much harder and slower way to grow.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little counterintuitive.
For sure. I think it is really tempting to try if things aren't working with, let's say you have that category. It's really tempting. 3 months in, 90 straight days of something not taking off. It's very psychologically tempting to say, let's try 3 more bets in 3 different areas.
Right.
Instead of hammering that rock over and over and over.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So should we go on to step 2, deciding which side of the marketplace?
Yeah. Okay. Right. So you constrain your marketplace. Say you're like, okay, we're going to be just in San Francisco. Step 2 is, okay, so now you have to figure out, are we going to drive supply or are we going to drive demand? Or do we want to do both at once? And so the second major learning from this research is that 80% of companies that I talked to focused and concentrate all their efforts on supply. And the 3 companies that did demand and focused on demand have very unique reasons for that. And so I'd say a main learning here is most of the time you're going to want to go on supply for a while. So, if you really think about it, you're trying to offer something to your customers. So you need some supply for demand to find any value in what you're doing. So there's always an initial phase of like, we need something. We need, Brian Rothenberg put it well, you need stock items on the shelves. And so the question is, when do you shift to demand? And so what I learned here is most of the time supply is the hardest part by far. And if you're finding that supply comes quickly, then you shift to demand. So as an example,
also kind of, you just follow the nose and it'll lead you there.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I don't think there was any example where it was both. It's almost always one or the other for a while.
All right.
So a couple examples. So Thumbtack, another great quote from Sander. When we were starting out, we looked at the biggest marketplace companies, eBay, Craigslist, Amazon. There was 2 things in common. They all had supply, and then they had really ugly products and brands. And so their learning was, all that matters is supply. Let's build liquidity and build supply, and we'll get to a great product later. And that's actually what they're focusing on now as a company. They actually have traction and they're scaling and things are working. And now they're excited about working on creating an amazing product.
Right. Interesting. Instead of saying this is going to be our competitive advantage, it was the observation of, okay, we can get by with a less than stellar UI, UX.
Exactly.
Interesting. That is somewhat counterintuitive, but that you would say, okay, this is our baseline's really low, so this doesn't need to be our innovation point.
Yeah. And I think the core is if you're providing a better experience to customers than and elsewhere, they'll deal with a bad experience if the product isn't amazing. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the learning they had here is just like, hey, if we have all these professionals that you can book, unlike anywhere else, you're gonna deal with it. Like Craigslist is the classic example.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And by better experience, is that kind of a euphemism for better supply?
I think it's a combination of it's cheaper, it's easier to get.
Yeah.
Those kind of things.
Great. Okay.
So figure out which side of the marketplace to concentrate on. In almost every case, it's supply. Maybe a couple more examples. Eventbrite, a quote from, I think, Tamara. In the early days, we were only focused on driving supply. We found that supply drove demand. Specifically, event creators drove traffic to our site. Most event organizers had some built-in demand that they brought with them. And so this touches on, okay, so I'm driving a bunch of supply. When is demand going to arrive? And how does that happen? We'll talk about this more, but it turns out one of the main levers is your supply will drive your demand. They'll bring demand to your site. So for example, Eventbrite, creators create an event and then they have a network that they're already reaching out to, and they just send them your Eventbrite link. And so that brings demand to your site without you doing anything. Another good example is DoorDash, Caviar, and Grubhub all did this, which is signage in the restaurants. And it turns out this is one of their main drivers of demand and new customers is people going to their favorite restaurant, seeing a Caviar sticker and like, oh, I'm going to download that so I can order this food at home. Or the restaurant's even promoting it and telling their customers, hey, download DoorDash so that you can use this anytime.
Or OpenTable. Go to our site and use OpenTable to make a reservation.
Yeah, exactly. That was a really good story where back in the day, they built websites for restaurants because they didn't have one, and they embedded the OpenTable reservation module. Initially, it was just a link to OpenTable. And that was where almost all of their demand came from initially.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So there's 3 examples that didn't focus on supply and focused on demand. And they're Rover, TaskRabbit, and Zillow. And the learning here is, one is just like, if it's really easy to get your supply, then you can quickly shift to demand. And that's essentially what happened with these guys. So Rover, their value prop was make $50 an hour, walking dogs anytime you want, which anyone can do. And it's meaningful money very easily. And so they had no problem creating supply. So they were essentially never supply constrained. TaskRabbit, similarly, they had a waiting list. They ended up having to add a fee to even apply to become a TaskRabbitter. Because again, you can make a bunch of money not doing very hard work. Anyone could do it essentially, and it's flexible.
Mm.
And Zillow is
the chairs we're sitting in, built by TaskRabbit.
So meta.
Yeah, it's a great service.
Below the line.
Below our asses. Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah. And then I guess Zillow is really interesting. They basically bootstrap supply by just using publicly available data to create, I think it was a Zestimate score. I think that was their first product, where they create here's how much your home is worth now based on publicly accessible information. They just kind of bootstrap supply and they just immediately had supply so they could shift straight to demand.
Oh, right. That's were there common threads amongst the ones that needed to be demand?
Yeah. So the threaders,
that's right.
It's basically extremely easy to build your supply. Either it's an amazing value prop, or you just, like Zillow did, you just bootstrap it based on existing data that maybe nobody's used in that way.
Okay. So it goes back to basically start with supply no matter what.
There's always start with supply because you need something. And then the question is when do you shift to demand? And the learning is for most companies, demand comes much later. Partly because your supply will create your demand and you don't have to actively go for it.
Okay.
So that's an interesting learning. Another really interesting, we talked about this, Patreon, how they basically realized they were in a marketplace and basically we're just going to build supply and we're just a supply company and a SaaS tool. So
do you think there are some companies that you chatted with that need to recognize that as well?
There's companies I'm chatting with just advising wise that I'm telling this sort of thing to, but I don't obviously the companies I talk to, they're all doing really well. They don't need to do this thing. I think Eventbrite is the closest to this, and I think they're still trying to figure it out. How much of an opportunity do we have on the demand side?
Well, it's clear you can, in a space that could benefit from a marketplace, benefit from discovery for buyers and that buying side, it's still massively profitable to build a SaaS type of business. Shopify being a perfect example, which is inches from being in the marketplace game,
right?
But has not focused on it for over 13, 14, 15 years and is arguably the biggest challenger to Amazon, which is one of the biggest marketplaces in the world.
Yeah, it's a really good example of don't be tempted necessarily to move to a marketplace. But yeah, I think a learning here is just be really aware of is the demand a real thing in our company? And we may want it and your supply may want it, but it may just not, the demand may not ever want this thing and it just may never materialize. And you may be better off just cutting that entire part of your strategy and roadmap and just going deep on the supply and the SaaS tool.
With my experience in 5.5 years with Tilt, there was the crutch. One of the things that I look back on that I think hurt us was I was such a good fundraiser that, and it became a crutch. It became a flaw to the business to be able to go out and fundraise. But one of the things that made it such a compelling fundraising vision for investors, when I look back on it, was this aspect of discovery. If we were able to build the Facebook of money, you'd be able to discover the events, experiences, commerce that your friends were participating in. And I know you're a power user of Tilt and maybe remember some signals of that, but never experiencing that in the product. And yet I take full responsibility for saying, no, we'll get there. And building out all of these discovery tools, discovery toolkit. Patreon, it really hits home that story of them realizing, or maybe later team members coming in and saying, hey, to get to this next level, actually, I think we need to own what we truly are rather than what we can be every day thinking about what we can be and saying, this is what we are and this is where we could be world class.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell you that the fundraising was made so much easier because of this idea of discovery and marketplace aspects of network effects. But had we taken a step back and said, okay, let's actually hone in on what we're really great at, it would not have had those aspects. And it actually would have helped us by not fundraising towards this future that may have just never been realistic.
Yeah, the touches on the quote from Tal at Patreon. Realizing we weren't a marketplace was the best thing that happened to us.
Interesting.
So I think that's one of the most interesting learnings from this work.
Do you know how many years in they had that observation?
Nope.
If you were to guess, was that within 8 months?
No, I think it took them a while. Like the way you put it is a lot of people wrongly think of Patreon as a marketplace, and most of the Patreon's team for a while thought of Patreon as a marketplace. So I think it took a couple of years.
Interesting. All right.
Just the speculation.
That's what you're paid to do as someone advising. You've got to fill in some of the gaps without perfect information. Okay. So shall we move on to phase 2, or is there anything else to add to that cracking the chicken and egg problem? Were there any big surprises in that cracking the chicken and egg problem? And actually, one of the things that I do want to ask you about is, what would be the above the line version of Airbnb? With you knowing the below the line version, you being there 7 years, you driving a lot of the growth there, what would be the above the line version that people talk about? And then what would the real version of the story be for someone that was there for 7 years?
I guess the above the line version is what's always out there. It was this magical experience, and people it became an overnight success, and we know exactly how it worked. And it's this design conference and serials and
well-designed site built by designers, the Craigslist growth lever.
Yeah, exactly.
Those are the things that you hear from the outside.
Yeah. And I think the reality is no one really knows what was key for Airbnb to be successful. I think like most of it was an amazing product that people wanted. So it was amazing product market fit. And then there was a bunch of stuff that early folks did. Unclear which one of them was extremely important and critical. And I think there's a sense of what was important, but nobody's measuring, really anything. There wasn't enough.
When you got there, or no one was measuring anything?
The data diligence was very low. There wasn't, a lot of data science at that point. There wasn't a lot of so Gustav came at 2013, something like that. Gustav Alstromer is now at YC. And he, I think, led the charge of, hey, we should understand where growth is coming from. We should understand how much of it is incremental. How much are we adding that's not just happening on its own? And that was 2013, 2014, which company started in 2008. So it's 6-7 years later when people started to really understand what's driving the company.
I think that is incredibly not only illuminating, but it's the reason for the podcast in the first place is the real stories. I think it's just such a disservice for founders, creators of all types, to hear the polished, fake version of the story and miss out on the truth that when I hear you talk about that, that's just revelatory. You can get 5 years in, 6 years in, I know it was a $1 billion valuation in 2011.
Yeah,
so
it's probably $5 billion.
$5 billion valuation and not have much visibility into how it's growing, why it's growing, what's driving that growth. And one interpretation would be that that was gross negligence. The other interpretation, which I think is far more accurate, is start with such strong product market fit that you don't need the world's most experienced growth team to drive levers of growth, that it almost is being pulled from you. That growth is being pulled from you. And if that growth is not being pulled from you and you're 3 years in and it's 3% month over month, 4% month over month, and it's not being pulled from you, or like we touched on the Rahul and Sean Ellis blog post on strong product market fit, then you might not have it. And you could try to get the world's greatest growth team, growth engine, growth thinking into the building, and it still not make that much of a difference. When you articulate that it was 5 years in, 6 years in, before there's data visibility, that blows my mind.
Yeah, something like that. And the way I think about it is you need this kind of combination of, for it to be a massive success and a big company like Airbnb, it needs to be both strong product market fit and good execution. So I think there's a lot of stuff that was done right. Maybe we may not even know what it was, but there was a lot of good stuff that happened that allowed it to grow to where it is today. And I think both those have to be true. If one of them is missing, there's always going to be a limit to how big you can get.
And there was always an obsession over the product experience, an obsession over quality. But yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think Etsy is actually a good example of a company that waited far too long to become data-driven and deliberate about where they were putting their resources. And there's a quote in this research about how, I don't know, like 80% of the company was working on a part of the product that was driving maybe 700 bookings a month. And like 2 engineers working on the rest of it, which was driving 10,000 bookings a month.
Bookings being sales?
Sales, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was just a lack of diligence around and understanding of what the growth drivers of the business are.
What would drive that? Again, it's usually not gross negligence. What would drive
I think
that?
It's probably a lack of understanding of the power of data and maybe a sense that like, hey, I know what's happening. Trust me, I got this. We know we don't need all this stats. So I think some companies feel that way. And my take is you have no idea what's happening without looking at your data. It's all just guesses.
Where would your balance be for a 4-person, 5-person, 10-person startup? How would you advocate for a balance in the perspective of data, how important data is to drive decisions when you are tiny versus knowing that it's very hard to incrementally iterate towards a product market fit?
Yeah, and you also don't have enough data to actually make statistically significant decisions and run experiments or anything like that. So I think there's tons of gut and just kind of guesses that happen early on. There's no downside to using the data that you do have, and data could be even just surveys and qualitative feedback from customers. So whatever data you have, the more the better. Then the question is, how do you use it? And there's this idea of data driven, but I think a better way to describe it is being data informed. Data informs your decision making. You take that as one input. Also take your experience and what you're hearing qualitatively and use all of that to inform what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it would be, I guess that would be the underpinning behind someone like Eventbrite saying, all right, let's focus on this vertical, this category, or TaskRabbit, let's focus on this category.
Yeah. A lot of it is just like, we're going to make this bet. And you have to do that when you're small.
Mm-hmm.
And especially if it's a two-way door decision, you can always go back.
Indeed. All right.
Yep.
So what's next?
Step 3. So we talked through step 1, constraining the marketplace. Step 2, figuring out which side to concentrate on. Usually it's going to be supply. So let's talk about how to drive supply. So this is looking at what did all of these marketplaces do to drive their initial supply. And it turned out there's 12 levers that work, the 12 most common levers that these companies used. Let me run through them real quick, and then I want you to guess which one you think is the most common.
All right.
Single player mode, referrals.
You'll have to give some explanation of what these are. So
single player mode is creating a product, almost a SaaS tool for one side of the marketplace.
Where they have utility from it
exactly.
From day one? Okay.
Exactly.
On their own. All right.
Exactly. So 2 is referrals, where you incentivize users to drive, so in this case, supply. You pay them to bring you supply. 3 is piggybacking off an existing network, for example, Craigslist. 4 is direct sales. 5 is subsidizing supply, paying for it, and just having it there by you just paying people to be on there. 6 is word of mouth, just kind of happening on its own, people talking about it. 7 is employees being your early supply. 8 is performance marketing, paid ads, Facebook, Google. 9 is loops, essentially virality. 10 is having events, organizing events for people to come to and like, oh, what's this? That's great. I'm going to sign up. 11 is SEO. And then 12 is using your community to drive supply. What would you say is the most common growth lever for early supply growth at marketplace companies?
Man, there's a couple in there that you'd think are mainstays. I would guess referrals, and word of mouth would have to be there. I feel like, even if it's not deliberate, but word of mouth, and then, referrals would be the digital extension of that. But you tell me.
Pretty good guess. So referrals tied for 2.
Okay.
Number 1 turns out is just sales, direct sales. Something like 60% of the companies that I talk to, sales and basically door to door, cold calls, cold emails.
Right.
The most common lever by far, which is like...
And they might not call it sales. They might call it like community outreach or community organization.
There's actually a community lever, which Etsy is the one that actually had a lot of value there, where it was really cool. They built street teams of Etsy sellers with no incentive. Just they're so excited about Etsy, they just went around and sold people on becoming an Etsy seller.
Okay, even though they're selling people on it, that wouldn't be sales. That would be separate.
Yeah, it's basically you don't have to hire like a sales and ops force. It's your community doing it for you.
I see. Okay, so sales is number 1.
Sales number 1, which is like, man, I got to hire a sales team. I got to, do these hard things. I just want to build product.
And were they selling for supply or?
Yeah. So this is supply. So this is the number 1 lever for how marketplaces drove their initial supply. 60% of them, sales was maybe the number 1 lever.
And what are some of the examples?
Some examples.
Sales.
Yeah. So let's see. So DoorDash, here's a quote. Primary lever for restaurant growth was pounding the pavement, inside and outside sales, people on the phones, door-to-door sales. Etsy, the main thing that I believe really worked was recruiting sellers in person at craft fairs and elsewhere. Uber Black was initially ops and phone driven. They just call limo companies and pitch them and guarantee them a minimum level of income if they kept their app running. And so this is true for every restaurant delivery company, Grubhub, Caviar, OpenTable. For Airbnb, there's a big lever, local ops teams. AngelList, it was Naval and Nivi just kind of convincing folks and investors to get on board. And then, that was how they drove that supply. And Patreon was reaching out to creators through YouTube. That was where they focused.
It's really interesting, and it highlights an aspect of tech startup ecosystem, Silicon Valley, that is, I think, wildly under discussed, which is how important sales is and that DNA, how important it is, and it can go by different names, and there's different aspects. But I remember hearing the adage that Google is a sales organization masquerading as an engineering organization, and it's just when you look at the compensations of leaders, the sales always outranks engineers, but they're trying to recruit engineers like crazy, and rightfully so. Every technology company is, and so the outward face is engineering driven, but inwardly, it's, if you're not, as Mark Andreessen told me one time, he said, if you're not on your way to, he said this for every tech company, which I don't know if it applies to every tech company, but he basically said, as a tech company, you're either on your way to building a massive sales organization or you're on your way to shutting your doors. And that's just, it's so under discussed, the sales side of things, that, sales is almost like a bad word in Silicon Valley, but we'd rather just build product and create viral loops and, SEO. Right. But that's this data that's really interesting, that it highlighted sales being the actual most common thread between the companies.
Yeah. As a counterexample, Uber and Lyft, not a big lever for them for supply, getting drivers. So one of their main levers was actually referrals, your point, and then piggybacking off an existing network. So this is the second most common lever. They're tied roughly, and these are, roughly accurate. So it's about 30% of the companies I talked to used piggybacking off of Craigslist or referrals as one of their main drivers. So an example, Airbnb, we talked about Craigslist. Allegedly, that's how they started growth. Lyft and Uber, they basically just posted job ads on Craigslist to get drivers on board. And then referrals, the companies that found a lot of power there, DoorDash, Caviar, Grubhub, Lyft, and Uber. And Airbnb, so this is like phase 2 when we'll get to scaling, but Airbnb referrals became a huge lever for supply later on. Initially, there was a couple experiments with it, and I think it drove some supply, but I don't know if it was a major lever.
And just to underscore your experience with Airbnb and that point that I think you made, which is so interesting, which is that it's just a panoply of things.
Yeah. What I found looking at this, I have this grid that is going to come out in the post, that Airbnb feels like they use the most levers, so they kind of spread across all of them. which is interesting. Oh, here's a fun fact. The median number of levers that companies used. So there's 12. The median number actually is 2.
Really?
Yeah. So most companies pick 2, and that's where
So it's not a monopoly. Maybe it's just our experience at Airbnb.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
That's really helpful for founders to think about where do you optimize your energy?
Yeah. And even so there's 2 median, and then 90% were like 3, 3 or less. So that's a learning right there.
There we go. For all growth teams out there, for all individuals in the startup ecosystem thinking about growth, I think it's that doesn't seem to be just relegated to marketplaces, but focus being power for everyone focusing on 1 to 2 levers. With Airbnb, what was the number?
Like 6.
And what was the number, if you can go back to 7 years ago, that you remember, hey, these were things that we deliberately focused on?
It's basically these. Yeah. So there's a lot of things that Airbnb was trying. And again, it was hard to know which one was working, but there's direct sales, there's local teams on the ground. And when I joined, it was 12 different offices at that point. They just kind of ramped up internationally right around the time I joined.
And this supply constrained marketplace with Airbnb.
Yeah, they're competing with the Samra brothers in Germany, and we kind of went head on. Oh, they're based in Germany, but they launched all across Europe. So there was local ops teams just going door to door, calling, emailing, trying to build supply, piggybacking off Craigslist, referrals, product, word of mouth. So word of mouth is, in this sorting, was 4th most common way that supply grew. So Airbnb, around the time we actually started measuring it, something like 70% of supply was word of mouth. To come and just, we're host talking to each other. Hey, you should make money on Airbnb by hosting.
And why do you say 4th then?
It's 4th across all of the companies.
Oh, I see.
But really large for Airbnb.
Okay.
But what's interesting, we're going to get to this, is on the demand side. So word of mouth on the supply side, not a massive lever. It was useful for maybe 1/4 of the companies. But on the demand side, it was the number one growth lever, it turned out, which isn't something you do, but it happened to drive it was the biggest way that demand grew for a lot of these marketplaces. So just a foreshadowing. Direct sales, number 1, piggybacking, number 2, and referrals tied for that, then word of mouth. And then maybe let's talk about a couple more. The next one was subsidizing supply, which good example of that is Uber and Lyft basically paying their drivers a salary or a minimum amount of money where they drive and you're on the road. If you're on the road for a certain amount of time, we're going to just pay you the minimum amount of money, and just going to bootstrap that until there's enough demand that makes it worthwhile.
And what goes into that calculus to say, all right, we're going to, and for Uber's case, lose money in geographies for a period of time. And it's the case for I imagine many of these, DoorDash or others that could be very similar. What is the calculus that goes into that if you did get into that with folks?
Nope, I did not. So I'm guessing there was some sense of how much do people need to stay on the road? Just like how much is it worth it to them? How much are we willing to risk on this sort of thing? Some sense of LTV for both supply and demand. I don't know.
And I imagine some sense of a leap of faith of
absolutely,
to get this first market off the ground, we got to do everything, including going way into the red, and hopefully having a playbook of, okay, this is what the arc looks like in a city.
Yeah, exactly. And that's when we talk, if we get to how to scale, that's, I think, the point at which you decide it's time to scale and kind of remove that constraint that we talked about, is you feel like you know how to launch this thing and crack chicken and egg problem quickly in the new market or new category. So to your question of what the calculus was, there's a stat I have around how Uber paid $40 an hour to drive. That was just the number that they went with. Yeah, that's pretty good.
That's really good.
Yeah,
and obviously we get drivers on the road. Yeah, and going back to the economics, I think now, at least I've read the speculative math that it's around $13, $14 an hour, and that could be wrong, but that's what it's been reported. How would a business manage that trajectory of establishing economics that are up here and then reality over time, bringing it down? And I know it's a pretty big question that you probably didn't get into, but as an advisor to marketplace companies, how would you think through that? How would you tell a founder or a growth marketer or growth leader to think through that?
I'd say the main thing is you want to set expectations early with your early supply. Like, hey, we're experimenting. You're an early pilot. We're going to try this thing. I'm not going to promise it's going to stay at this level for forever. We're trying to understand what people are willing to pay and, enjoy it while you can. And then we're going to adjust as we learn more.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the main thing.
All right.
So a couple more interesting things before we move on to the fourth step. One is this idea of single player mode, which when I was going into this, I was thinking that a lot of people use this tactic, which is basically build an interesting product for one side of the marketplace, build up that side, and then bring on the other side. But it turns out it's very rare. OpenTable is the most classic example where they built a reservation system for restaurants.
And like you said, sometimes the website for the restaurant.
And then the website. Yep. And because they had nothing on the demand side, their pitch, and the quote here is around how their sales pitch was 90%. This is the best reservation software out there. It's going to make your lives a lot easier. And then 10%, we're going to drive customers to you and book some tables. And then over time that shifted as they started driving more and more demand. And now it's mostly, we're going to help you book a bunch of tables.
But to your last point around the Uber driver or what advice you'd give, it sounds like they framed it pretty well.
Yeah.
That they underpromise
Mm-hmm.
to be able to overdeliver rather than churning through customers with this dream scenario that wouldn't materialize for years.
Yeah, and they had to build this amazing product that was better than what restaurants were using. So up to that point, restaurants were just using little books and writing down reservations and passing around this book. And their pitch was, this is going to be a lot better. And it turned out it was better. And then it was like sales guys walking around with like tower computers that they'd hook up. They'd buy them DSL. They'd hook it all up. They'd have a map of the restaurant saved for their customer service team in case there was a problem because they needed, they're not taking reservations on a Friday night. That sucks. Yeah. And so they had to tell them exactly, go over here, turn left, unplug this thing, go over here on the right, plug that thing in.
Wow.
So
restaurants
scrappy.
don't necessarily have an IT person on staff.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
Yeah. Okay. That's fascinating.
And then the other interesting learning is performance marketing. You think that'd be a massive lever for supply. Turned out only 2 marketplaces used it, Uber and Lyft. The rest was not a major lever for growth for supply.
And is that basically a bucket for all advertising or just the performance marketing of Facebook and Google?
Yeah, like digital ads.
Hmm.
Yeah. So let's see. So the rest are loops, events, SEO, and community. So there's no real marketing or PR lever for supply growth through any of these companies, really, based on this research.
Wow.
Different on the demand side.
Right. And as a customer, we see the demand side so much. Mm-hmm. We see the marketing on the demand side so much. You'd think it's part of that supply aggregation as well, but it sounds like it's not.
Yeah, it's very different.
Cool.
Okay.
Man, this is such good stuff.
Drink some matcha.
I'm just taking a break from this for a second. As you went through this, spent innumerable hours crunching through all of these conversations and doing the research. What were your top 2 or 3 biggest takeaways that you sit today, this afternoon, that you think about when you think about this wealth of data and knowledge you captured?
I'd say one is just how straightforward some of this playbook ended up being. 1, constrained somehow, probably geographically. 2, focus on supply. 3, there's a couple levers they should pick for driving supply. And then same thing, pick a couple levers for demand. So, when you try to build a marketplace, I think up to now, you come at it, we're like, I have no idea what I'm doing. Do I drive demand? Do I drive supply? Should I go big? Should I do SEO? Should I do direct sales? And I feel like this actually just tells you 1, 2, 3, 4, and you're on your way.
I feel as an investor advisor, I feel like I'd also pair that, feel as a loud ringing voice of like when it seems that easy.
Yeah.
There's a reason there's probably 10,000 marketplace startups dead on the tracks that didn't become one of these 17, probably from what you shared earlier, from not having strong enough product market fit.
Yeah.
And that, the ability to rent power tools from
Yeah.
neighbors.
Oh my God. So many companies trying that.
Yeah, that it sounds great, but what do you think would be to lead to their demise after your research? Is it just not good enough product market fit? Is frequency of use, margins?
I think that's what it is. I think it just like gut level, it feels like it's the thumbtack problem. If people don't need it often enough, they're not going to remember to use it. There's not enough of a business model to build around that. I think that's probably the issue.
Well, during your research, we chatted a little bit about my perspective that I feel like it is the high level litmus test for supplier demand constraint. One, it's in the effort, how hard is one or the other. But two, if it's more expensive than the alternative, then you're likely going to be demand constrained. I mean, you're going to have to drum up the demand for this tour through Golden Gate Park that's going to be $25 versus walking through Golden Gate Park or Central Park on your own, and therefore demand constrained. Versus if it's cheaper than the alternative and a better experience, then you're going to be supply constrained because the demand is there waiting for something less expensive and better. And that comes to mind. The other thing is, I think there's something we haven't talked about, but frequency and margins. That I remember hearing the advice from Jeff Jordan, who's on the board of Airbnb and ran OpenTable and was at eBay before that. I remember him saying if it's low frequency, it has to be massive margins. If it's low margins, it has to be high frequency. So that kind of is an Uber and Airbnb. Uber making a few dollars per ride, Airbnb making sometimes a few $100s per booking. Airbnb, you can do it twice a year. Uber, you've got to use it twice a week.
Yeah, and that's why I think Thumbtack is so interesting. They don't have either of those, and they figured it out. And I think it was just a slog. I think the way the founder described it is just brute forcing it. Just kept at it, just kept building and just doing everything they had to do to create liquidity and then drive demand to it. So in these rare cases, somehow it works out. And I think a lot of it is just how much time do you have? How do you buy yourself time to keep building and building? So it's Thumbtack's an amazing story. I don't think a lot of people know enough about them.
No, I don't. Yeah. What are some of the other?
The other interesting things about Thumbtack is Instant Book. This is a whole other podcast. Is just the shift to Instant Book, which we did at Airbnb, where they just realized we're not going to win if we're not allowing people to book a thing immediately. And instead of sitting there waiting and getting ignored or rejected. So they went through this down phase of moving to an Instant Book world where they slowed growth and it started kind of declining. And then they finally got over the hump and now it's taken off.
Interesting. So meaning instead of waiting for the plumber to get back to you the next day that, hey, Friday at 10 will work. Instead it's just boom, Friday at 10, it's got to work and the plumber has to agree to whenever they get something added to their Thumbtack calendar, they've got to show up.
Exactly. Yeah. So Airbnb, we did the same thing. And looking back, it was probably one of the best decisions we ever made is to shift to an Instant Book model.
Right. And it's interesting that they took a short-term hit.
Yeah, that's ballsy.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk step 4. So we did supply. So let's talk demand. How do these marketplace companies drive their initial demand? So I'm going to give there's 12 levers also that are the most common, and I'll just say them in order.
Please.
No guessing necessary.
Okay.
So number 1 turned out to be word of mouth. Most of the way that a lot of these companies grew is just word of mouth. People talked about it because it was an awesome product. To your point, maybe it was cheaper. Maybe it's just more convenient.
Why does that not get talked about enough? I feel like maybe it's just, and maybe this is like a meta comment on startups. It's not blog worthy,
right?
Like you can't talk about what you accomplished on your X team if it's just word of mouth that drove the growth.
I think it's that. Plus, people don't often know that it's word of mouth. They're like, "Oh wow, look at this! Everything's working.
Right.
People are coming. It's great."
Yeah.
So I think a lot of it is you have no idea, and
how would you have an idea? How could you have an idea?
You either do surveys offline or on arrival when someone visits your site. Hey, how'd you hear about us?
Yeah.
So again, Gustav at Airbnb did this at Airbnb, and I was like, holy shit, that's good to know.
Yeah. Wow.
So word of mouth. 2 is also really fascinating. Is the second biggest lever for demand growth is supply driving your demand. And so an example of this is DoorDash, Caviar, and Grubhub. They all do this. When you go to a restaurant, I think we talked about this. They have stickers in the restaurant. And you're like, oh, cool. I'm going to download DoorDash and now order from there. So those are common examples. Etsy is super interesting. Their supply was also their demand because they're buying things
from each other
to build the thing and make the thing that they're selling.
Oh, interesting.
So they're like, we often don't even differentiate between the two as a spectrum of like full-time seller or seller and buyer.
Yeah.
I think is the way they described it.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then Patreon and Eventbrite, same. We talked about how the creators tell people, hey, come here, come pay me here, come book your ticket here. And so that they didn't have to do anything to bring those people in. People were bringing them themselves.
One of the overarching comments that I'll say about marketplaces is I feel like what I love about marketplaces as a customer is that everyone's aligned. It's not an advertising business like Instagram or like Yelp where or Google where it's like, I'm wondering where am I being manipulated here? But with Airbnb, with TaskRabbit, it's just the business. Airbnb wants to give you the best listing possible for where you want to go. And their revenue is built on that. My experience is built on that. At least the best experience I'm going to have is built on that instead of alignment. It's one of the things that I think marketplaces are still just getting going and under discussed. And it's, the last few years, we touched on the last few years, it's become in vogue. But I think it's, in the beginning of the web, the first 20 years, advertising was it was needed because e-commerce was such a small part of the way we use the web. Over the next 20 years, as that continues to explode, advertising models, this is just a James opinion, but I think advertising models are going to run business after business into the ground because it eventually catches up to you. You're on the opposite side of the customer. I mean, Facebook is not in the business of sending me the best content in my feed anymore. It's the most engaging content, which is a subtle but powerful distinction. And someone like Airbnb or Amazon, they're still and always will be in the business of serving up the best possible result for what I'm trying to buy, trying to search for.
Create some controversy. I'm going to disagree.
Oh, cool. All right.
I think it's hard to give up free stuff. Like, hey, Facebook, it's free. I'm going to find all this value there. And in exchange, I'll give away a little privacy and see some ads. And I think that's hard to displace. And I don't know how else you give something like that away for free that's not advertising. And there's so much money being offered because if you have a company, you want to advertise it somewhere. And so you want to pay people to do that. And there's always going to be a desire to take that money and do that advertising for you, combined with people are willing to look at some ads to get some cool free stuff. So I think it would have to be really strong, a really strong fear of privacy and like, oh my God, I really hate ads for that to go away. But
I don't know. To disagree with you, I pay for Netflix every month.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you right up,
content.
It not only crushes the content on Facebook, but I'm not using Facebook nearly as much or YouTube Premium. It's one of my favorite purchases that I've ever made. It's YouTube Premium to get rid of the ads and to pay per month that I'm on a family plan with friends. Hope YouTube doesn't find out. But that is one of my favorite purchases to pay for that content. And my YouTube and Netflix content consumption, I mean, I probably consume about 20 minutes of Facebook a month now, or 20 minutes a week of Facebook. And it's skyrocketed for Netflix, YouTube.
And do you think that's because you're tired of the ads or it's just like not good content anymore? Because I think you could think about Instagram, like do you spend time on Instagram or Twitter?
No, I deleted Instagram.
Cool.
I do spend some time on Twitter for sure. So I don't know, but I do feel like it is being free. And then listeners I know want us to shut up to get back to the marketplace stuff, but I do feel like being free is a great first step to get adoption. But what I mean of just the business then working against the customer is everybody's aligned in the beginning. You, me, Facebook is aligned in the beginning to get to 100 million users, make it as good as possible, put off revenue generation. But then you have a business that goes from get everybody on the platform, get them engaged for as long as possible, to now let's put 20% of our engineers on advertising.
Absolutely.
Now let's put 40%. Now let's put 60%. And I don't know the exact figure for Facebook, but I would imagine there's 70 to 80%. Please, people tweet at me if I'm way wrong in this, but 70% of engineering resources going for advertising, building for advertising, rather than product iteration for you and I as consumers. And that's not going to kill growth, the day that switches. But that is 70% of the engineering resources working against the product becoming better for you and I, and it's getting better for Nike to advertise to us. And I think that ultimately there's this Rubicon, and once it's crossed to where that product is getting worse and worse for me, and something like Netflix or YouTube Premium, which YouTube Premium is I love it. It is my favorite piece of app, because you open it up and I'm learning music production, learning how to put this podcast together, learning whatever it is, or taking in some frivolous piece of entertainment with no ads. And I don't know if Facebook could ever get to a model where it's subscription. But anyhow, that would be the counterexample for advertising. In 2019 now, it's possible to have an actual subscription. People pay for it.
Yeah, I think like New York Times moving to a paywall is a good example of what you're talking about. Instead of ads, you just pay a monthly fee. So I think that's fascinating.
But I think I'm still formulating this opinion.
Yeah. But I think what's interesting, I think you make a good point. Another benefit of a marketplace is it aligns incentives between
100% of the engineers. Exactly. 100% of the engineers at Airbnb, you and I can speak to verifiably, are working on making the product better for you and I to
book more often.
Go to Barcelona and find an even better place.
That's great. I'm going to update this doc and add that.
All right. Well, glad I could contribute something. Okay. Now, again, I will go back to shutting up and letting you talk. Okay.
So we're talking about driving early demand. So we talked about word of mouth as the most common lever. So let's see if there's any interesting factoids here. I guess in a couple quotes, TaskRabbit, 90% of their customers came through word of mouth, according to Jamie, who is, I think, the head of marketing at TaskRabbit for a long time. And then Lyft, word of mouth was huge early on. It was the reason behind the pink mustaches.
Yeah, I remember that for sure.
And even Uber, word of mouth was huge. Andrew Chen said how the end state was roughly 35% of their growth was word of mouth. Early on, it was 50 to 60%, according to their measurements. So number 2 was supply driving demand. So we talked about a bit of that. We talked about how OpenTable basically did that through the module. Let's see. So third most common lever for driving demand, SEO. Grubhub quote from Casey Winters, SEO is 30% of all of their new users came through SEO. Is their number one lever. Things like Thai food near me. And the way they did that is they built a loop where they also created restaurant websites, scanned their menus. People found them through SEO, ordered, drove demand to the restaurant. Restaurants like, oh, amazing. And that created more demand for restaurants, because demand started to come at them. So SEO, Thumbtack. Oh yeah, here's a funny story about Thumbtack I'll share real quick. So early on, Thumbtack had no idea what SEO was. And so Sanders shared a story how one day, one of their co-founders, Jonathan, was in a bar in San Francisco and by chance sat next to one of the world's top SEO experts. Didn't share the name. So they started chatting about Thumbtack, and at some point he's like, wait, what is SEO? And soon that guy joined their board and helped them architect their SEO strategy, and ended up being 80 to 90% of their growth.
Wow.
Serendipity.
I mean, and it makes sense. You'd look for plumber in San Francisco.
Exactly.
Be the first place I'd go would be Google.
Exactly. So that was SEO, and maybe talk about one more, loops. So Grubhub, I talked about how they created content menus online. They aggregated on their website, got traffic through SEO, converted that traffic, and then they can now promise this traffic to restaurants. Look at all this traffic we're getting. And then that got on more restaurants. And Etsy was similarly, where people were buying supplies for their homemade products and then becoming sellers and buying that stuff, and kind of create a little loop within itself.
Do you think something like, it comes to mind that Yelp could have been a marketplace?
Yes.
We talked about things moving away from marketplaces or realizing that they weren't.
Yeah.
Are there examples, and maybe that is one that could have and maybe should have moved towards a marketplace?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that. Like, is Yelp a marketplace? I think they're super on the fringe because there's no transaction that happens. And I could be wrong. This is just my opinion through Yelp. And so I think they missed that. And I think they're starting to actually think about that now because they're basically an advertising business, just like sponsored, restaurant posts. And so I think they could have been a lot bigger if they allowed you. I don't know would you order through Yelp? I don't know. Would you pay the restaurant through Yelp? I don't know exactly what they would have done. But yeah, I think they're like right on the fringe of if it's a marketplace or not, according to the definition that I had.
Yeah.
So loops, referral. I guess I'll just walk through the rest real quick. Referrals, sales, having events, single player mode also on the demand side, just like a useful tool for demand. So an example there is Grubhub just scanning menus of restaurants. So now you know the menu. You may not be able to order anything, but at least you have a menu and it's useful to you. And then partnerships and mobile. So mobile was an interesting growth lever for Thumbtack and Zillow. They were really early on mobile and that allowed them to grow.
Makes sense.
So that's that.
All right. So that is 12 levers of supply, 12 levers for demand. That's phenomenally useful to hear all of those laid out. Are we moving on to phase 2 now?
Depends on how much time we got.
Well, I know that phase 3 is a little bit of a teaser. That's coming. More information on phase 3 is coming and a later piece.
Yes.
So maybe we talk about phase 2 and that'll be a deep enough dive before.
Let's do it.
Before people are yelling at us to stop.
Yeah. And we'll go briskly.
Or however briskly you want.
Let's just, another 3 hours.
All right. Yeah, there we go.
Great. I'm going to take everyone.
Hey, this stuff could save people 5 years in the wrong direction. So or in a unnecessarily painful direction. So maybe there's value to everything you're laying down right now.
Great. Let's do it. So phase 2 is scaling the marketplace. So we've cracked chicken and egg. You have this flywheel going. At some point, it's time to scale, whether it's expand to more markets, invest more money, expand to new categories. And the way I think about when is it time to scale, I think it's probably a combination of there's a sense that you have product market fit, however you measure that, whether it's this question around how dissatisfied you'd be if it disappeared that we talked about around Sean Ellis and Rahul, or maybe it's retention is plateaus and it's something about above 20-30%, or it's something else. I think you had this comment around intensity. Yeah.
Alex Schultz from Facebook, who runs growth at Facebook, told me it was amazing. He actually said he can look at any product, any company, and everyone should write this down because I think about it all the time. He said that he can look at any feature within Facebook or any company and tell you whether they are going to be successful or not. It could be a feature like videos or whatever it is in Facebook, and he'll look at 3 graphs: usage, up and to the right is the shape you want for usage. Retention, you touched on it. You want it to asymptote 20%, 30%, but you just want it to basically not go to 0. So asymptote. And then intensity, you want a U curve or a J curve or a smile curve. There's not a lot of academic understanding of this, but you basically want it to, whether it's, let's say it's Facebook, you use it 45 minutes the first week, 35 minutes the second week in 2004, 25 minutes the third week. And then in the fourth week, more of your friends are on it. And so then it goes up to 35 minutes again, then 45 minutes the week after that, then 55 minutes and it's turning into a J.
What a dream.
Yeah, what a dream. That's a great business to have. But I will say the below the line version of that, it is, and Sean Parker has told me this, that they were still pitching another business. While this was happening, they thought, well, I don't know, social network, that's for college kids. How valuable is that? We have this other thing called Wirehog. So let's fundraise for that. They started fundraise while they lived in Palo Alto for that before Facebook. So fascinating. Just founders continually, and Y Combinator talks about this, continually will take for granted what they have. And this goes back to maybe your comment around 2 levers. It can be really intriguing or multiple categories, to do too much and losing sight that, man, we actually have really strong product market fit and product love with this specific category and this specific constrained, geography or whatever it is. Blow that out of the water before saying, you know what, this is good, but it's only 1,300 people. Let's try to do 5 other things, and missing out on, the special things that you might have. And it's not the numbers, it's the trends that matter.
Yeah. To that point, I have a below the line kind of section around what companies would have done differently if they were to do it again. That if we have time, we can get into. But the second most common theme was just to focus more. Focus on a business, on one use case, focus on a metric, focus on like a single category. So exactly to that point.
Okay, well, what's the first thing? I have to ask, what's the first thing that they listed? And then we'll go back to phase 2.
Be more aggressive. So it's invest, more money, faster. Andrew Chen shared that he's like, what would Travis say if I were to ask him? Probably be get into China faster, or take advantage of channels earlier. And rovers, expand into dog walking before WAG got in there.
All right. Well, going back to phase 2.
Phase 2, scaling. So again, I think when to think about scaling, one is however you want to measure product market fit, you feel like you have it. And 2, you have a sense of how to solve the chicken and egg problem, and almost have a playbook in the new city/category. That's the way I think about it.
And you could add in also making sure it's on the right economics.
Maybe, I don't know, Uber.
Yeah, I know that maybe that doesn't apply, but just product market fit. Would you be dissatisfied in the Rahul Sean Ellis post?
Yeah.
Or would you be very disappointed if this went away? And 40% of people, if 40% say they'd be very disappointed, then it's true. But if it's free,
right,
and then you make $100 a month, and then that number goes to 3%, then it might have been a misrepresentation.
So maybe like a path to a business model.
Right. But you're totally right, because Uber, which I think is going to be a phenomenally massive business for decades to come, is obviously notoriously still burning significant cash for markets that it's hard to say, they figured out the economics.
So many ways to do it.
All right.
So within this section, the way I approached it is, what are the 3 most common questions that I get from companies that are trying to scale their marketplace? And the 3 most common questions are, how do I know if I'm supplier demand constrained? What levers should I invest in when I'm scaling? And how do I maintain quality in my marketplace? So the first part is, how do I know if I'm supplier demand constrained? What's emerged from this is there's basically 3 buckets of companies. 40% of marketplaces are forever supply constrained. Uber and Lyft are examples of that.
What, Airbnb?
No, so they're by market. Some markets are supply constrained, some are demand constrained. And we'll dive in there a little bit, but basically each of those companies eventually develops a model to know. Because for a while, Airbnb had no idea. What should we be doing? Should we be driving demand, driving supply? And so eventually we got to a model that told us which one it was. So 40% of companies are forever supply constrained. So it's almost nice in a sense that at least let's just go supply. 15% are always demand constrained. And those, let's see, in this research, it was AngelList, Rover, and TaskRabbit, always demand constrained. And then there's this group that's just depends on the market or category, and that's Airbnb, Caviar, Etsy, Grubhub, Instacart, Thumbtack, Zillow. So like a quote from Andrew at Uber, we didn't think about supply demand imbalances a lot because we were always supply constrained. And that actually led to things like surge pricing because they had so much demand. They needed to almost slow down that demand and give suppliers an incentive to come online. So pricing is a cool lever to use when you want to slow one side down and incentivize the other side. Yeah, so the group that is the depends group, sometimes supply, sometimes demand. A couple examples of what folks did there. Grubhub, Casey, winners of Grubhub, they basically built a model that looked at coverage in a market. And they looked at what percentage of restaurants in the market are already on Grubhub. And then what are the number of orders per restaurant that's on Grubhub? And the markets that are in the higher percentile of orders per restaurant means they need more restaurants in those markets. And so that's how they prioritize where to drive supply. And at Airbnb, and I think a lot of travel kind of companies approach it this way, is first you start with your occupancy rate. So what's our occupancy rate in San Francisco? Is it above a certain percentage? So we figured out maybe it's like above 70% occupancy, we're supply constrained because the remaining percentage is not the best stuff. And then today they've moved to kind of an econometric model that tells them how much revenue can they drive by adding one additional unit of demand or one additional unit of supply.
When did it move to a pretty advanced econometric model?
I think just like a year or two ago.
So for younger companies out there, you can get pretty far without that. But it does seem necessary to get pretty predictive with or algorithmic in this.
Yeah, like who knows what Airbnb could have been if they moved to this earlier. So a middle ground that I've been advising companies to use is, and this maybe is getting too much in the weeds, but you look at your conversion rate on a graph crossed with your occupancy rate. So you just map both those things on a chart. And you look for where conversion drops at what occupancy level. So if every time it gets above 50%, conversion drops, there's almost a downward inflection point. Probably tells you that's where you're supply constrained.
Okay. Yeah. That's a good middle ground. All right.
So that's that. So kind of part one of scaling is figuring out how do you know if you're supply or demand constrained. So either you're going to be one or the other forever, or you're going to build a model or a metric that you're going to look at. And we shared a couple. 2 is what are the levers that you want to use when you're scaling? And what's interesting is 1, there's less levers that folks use at scale. And 2, they use a lot more of them. It's a lot more widely distributed. And I think what happens is, oh man, we got to grow. What else can we do? Let's add this new lever. Let's add this thing. And so...
And by that going beyond 2 to the other parts of the 12, or did the 12 become 20?
No, they go to 9.
Okay, so it's still the same 12. Or about
they cut down. So a couple things no longer are useful. So I guess, let's see.
Oh, I see. So the entire list goes to 9.
Yeah.
And companies use 3, 4 of those, but they go from 2 to 9 different levers.
It's the max, like the opportunities reduce, and then people distribute across them more.
Do you have a median?
Let's see. No. But it's higher.
What would you ballpark it? If the median was 2 when you were just getting going?
Yeah. Let me just eyeball this.
All right. Take your time. And it's a podcast, so we can edit out if you want to take...
Fast forward to 10 minutes later. Nope, we're still here. I'd say like 4. Just kind of, like 4.
But that's pretty fascinating. Even companies at scale or scaling can be massive and still 3 or 4 things, and it's not 7, 8.
Yeah. And I think part of it is at scale, even a small incremental improvement is very impactful
to the things that are working.
Yeah. So like conversion. So going through them real quick. So number 1 is performance marketing, the most common lever for growth at scale. Super interesting.
And that's the demand.
Just this is, I simplified it here, and just in general, what's helping you grow as a company. There's going to be too many steps and it got too meta.
Okay.
So I combined them. So just across both sides, performance marketing, the most common lever, Google, Facebook ads. 2 is expanding geographically, just going to more markets. So Instacart is a good example. For many years, a big lever for us was expanding geographically. We got better at selecting and launching new markets. Each new market would reach critical growth milestones faster and faster. So I think essentially any company that is location-based, that's just always going to be a big lever. 3 is conversion, increasing, just optimizing the funnel, getting more people to go from landing on your site into purchasing. And it's interesting, it wasn't huge for everybody. Like Grubhub, for example, it wasn't like one of their major levers. It was other things.
What do you mean?
So like for Grubhub, for example, optimizing the funnel and the user experience, they wouldn't consider it one of their major growth drivers.
What were theirs?
Theirs were, let's say, SEO, I think was really large, geographic expansion, performance marketing, and loops.
Okay. So go back to the entire list of the 9.
Cool. So performance marketing, expanding geographically, conversion, SEO, 4th biggest, most common. So this is just in general. I don't think anyone's looked at what are the most used levers for growth across marketplaces. So just this here is really fascinating to me.
It's so fascinating. So say the first 4 again, and I might ask you to repeat the 9 because this is the heart of the artichoke right here.
Delicious. Let's have some artichoke after this.
Yeah, I'm getting hungry actually. Let's do that.
No, we're not pausing.
No, we're going to keep going, but then it's artichoke time after this.
Artichoke time. Hashtag. Okay. Performance marketing, expanding geographically, conversion, SEO, then sales. So still really effective for companies like Breather, Caviar, DoorDash, Grubhub, Instacart, OpenTable. So they're still, recruiting restaurants door to door, things like that, maybe calling. Referrals is the next one, which really powerful for Airbnb, Caviar, DoorDash, Lyft, and Uber. Next is Loops, which we talked a bit about, which is, so an example there, Eventbrite. You get invited to an event, you see Eventbrite in your email, you're like, oh, I should host on Eventbrite. And that creates a new event creator.
That was a major growth driver for us.
Mm-hmm.
Massive one. You'd get recruited into a friend's pool and then we'd convert you into starting out. Yeah.
So according to this research, it was really big for Eventbrite, Grubhub, OpenTable, and Uber. Interestingly, not Lyft. That's something that I learned. They tried this kind of thing and it wasn't massive for them.
And what about Etsy?
Not according to this. Yeah.
Okay.
But PR. So that's the last one, PR. Big for Etsy, TaskRabbit, and Zillow at scale. That's still a big part of how they grow.
Really interesting. Yeah, you don't hear that too often. And maybe it's because the narratives are more dominated by the early stage type of tactics. But it's almost like you think PR is everyone thinks it's going to be big and then everyone tries it and it's not that impactful.
So looking back, so early on, PR was effective for 6 companies.
Okay.
Airbnb, Rover, Lyft, TaskRabbit, Uber, Zillow. But it becomes less effective later, which makes sense, I think.
And then more effective for some?
I think continues to be effective for them.
Okay.
I think that's the learning there.
Excellent.
So that's step 2.
Okay.
And then next step is maintaining quality. I think it's kind of undervalued, something I worked on at Airbnb. How do you maintain quality at scale? And so I found that there's, 10 ways people do that.
How many of the companies actively invest in maintaining quality?
Everybody. Everyone has something that they're doing.
All right. Good answer. Yeah. I would hope so, but that's good for them.
Let's redact the one that isn't.
Yeah. No,
Just kidding. They'll do it.
That's great. Walk me through maintaining quality and what it means.
So it's creating a good experience, I think, essentially for the guest. That's kind of the way I think about it. How do you maintain a great experience for the demand side?
Sounds flowery. Give me some more specifics of.
Okay. So let's talk about what ways people maintain quality. So the most common is what I call standards and penalties. Creating a standard on your marketplace and then kicking people off if they're not meeting them. So an example at Airbnb, I worked on this for a while. It's called host standards. If a host is above a certain cancellation rate or below a certain star rating or response rates are below a certain percentage, you warn them, and then you eventually deactivate them. And that's something, Uber did. They kicked off drivers that are below a certain rating. Lyft did the same thing. And basically that's the most common pattern for maintaining quality. Just setting a standard, a minimum bar, and then removing people that fall below that standard.
Were there marketplaces that improve their quality over time? Or does it all asymptote and then it's like, all right, we need to keep growing. We need to keep scaling. Yeah. This is the minimum though.
Don't know.
All right.
Good follow-up question.
I would hope. My experience with Airbnb is that it has improved over time rather than, and Uber would be the other direction. But that's anecdotal.
Let's do more research.
All right. Okay.
So there's, standards, penalties. The second most common way people maintain quality is they manually onboard their, in this case, supply, which is, so an example, Lyft, they had early classes for drivers where they kind of showed them, here's what it takes to be a good driver. And
do they do this at scale or just early on?
It's a good question. I think they do. I think they have this ambassador program where every new driver has to kind of be vetted by a driver. And I imagine they've automated it more and there's more product as a part of it. I think DoorDash and Caviar and I imagine Grubhub, similarly, here's a quote that they have. So DoorDash, they have a whole team dedicated to merchant operations that helps restaurants understand what the experience of doing deliveries is, where how it's going to affect their kitchen, how to handle pickups, and the kind of hour by hour what's going to happen to set them up for success. And then another example is, let's see, Uber. Andrew shared this story that in the early days, every driver was interviewed by an employee. The first 20 were interviewed by Travis. Make sure that the driver culture and the type of drivers online.
Only the first 20? Come on.
You have things to do.
Not that impressed. Okay.
Oh, another fun story. Instacart, the way they manage quality is at one point they They went to markets and bought one of everything and then took photos of that. So they'd have high quality product photos in their product.
Right. And they did. They nailed the photo quality. It's great.
Good job.
And it's such a small, it sounds like a small thing, but I remember when I first used the product, I was like, that does look like an avocado. Okay.
Or
artichoke, actually.
Oh, artichokes.
Yeah, I'm team artichoke.
Hashtag artichokes.
Okay. All right.
And then maybe one more. There's a lever around finding early signals of supply quality. So knowing what's going to be good and then bumping it up in the rankings and maybe kicking off things that are not going to be great. Rover has this funny story where over time they've narrowed down one question they could ask new sitters that predicted very highly whether they're going to be a good sitter. And the question was, where does the dog sleep at night? And if the question is in my bed, highly correlated to they're going to be a great sitter. And so what they started doing is if people answered it that way, they started bumping them up in search immediately.
That's interesting. Could have gone either way in my head. I mean, it sounds actually great, but it also sounds a little inappropriate on some weird level.
Yeah, I think it shows you love dogs.
That's right. Yeah, that's great.
So that's that. There's a lot more there. Search ranking is another big one, but I'd say we zoom forward to maybe the what people would have done differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And then for people to know the phase 3, evolving your marketplace, managed marketplaces, which is that's not a flowery language, but a very specific language for a different type of different type of marketplace. A managed marketplace, you're vetting everything, and then adding new business lines like Uber Eats. But you're going to come out with, as I understand, you're going to come out with information and content on that in a future post, right?
Future.
Great.
More research to do.
I cannot wait to read it.
Thanks, James.
I think that will be really interesting for people beyond just building these things, but understanding which ones are going to be massively valuable over time and which ones might be relegated to one or two verticals.
Mm-hmm.
So jumping into, what would people do differently?
Yeah, so there's a lot. Let's see. I don't even know how long this list is.
Well, mention maybe the top 3 or 4. You mentioned the first one, which was lack of focus. Was that, or no, not being aggressive enough.
Being aggressive enough. Yeah, so that was the most common. Let's see. I think Zillow, they're like, we should have taken advantage of more channels earlier on. SEO and email. Grubhub, looking back, the Grubhub, they were one of the first food delivery companies. And now there's like DoorDash spending, and getting $2 billion from SoftBank and folks like that. And back then, I think it looked like Grubhub was spending a lot of money. I think it was like $80 million they raised. And everyone's like, what are you? So much money. And so looking back, I think one of the learnings is we could have gone a lot bigger and a lot faster. And then we talked about the Uber story of maybe going to China faster.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, a good story there is actually Airbnb expanding into Europe. So I don't think Airbnb had a plan to go big that quickly. And then the Samwer brothers came around and threatened that they're going to destroy Airbnb and win Europe. And Airbnb is going to have to buy them or they're going to buy Airbnb. And the way Airbnb responded is expanded immediately into Europe. And it almost forced them to be more aggressive. And in the end, I think that was very important for their growth and their current success. And so another example of being more aggressive ends up working out.
Thank the good Lord for your competition.
Yeah.
In many ways.
Painful, but sometimes valuable.
Okay.
And then, to focus. So I think Breather's a good example. Julian shared that he was, they built Breather. Breather is an app where you could basically, today you book meeting rooms. But for the longest time, they're like, no, we don't want to just be a meeting room company. We want to be this nice consumer brand that you can have meeting rooms and rooms for whatever you want, for snaps, for meeting with friends and hanging out. And I think one of the learnings is we should have just realized it's a meeting room on demand. And if they realized that earlier and were able to focus on that one use case, their sense is they would have been a lot more successful. And then Eventbrite, a good example there is they never created dedicated supply and demand teams. They always kind of mix them together. And they're a learning there that Brian Rothenberg shared is he wished they'd create more focus around each one and dedicated teams to each lever. So those are
makes sense. What's number 4?
Next is leveraging data sooner. This is the Etsy story I shared earlier around people just kind of working on things they thought were important and not necessarily things that were drivers of the business. And so there's a learning there of just let's use data. Let's understand what drives our business and where we should be investing.
Right.
Next is Rover shared this, that avoiding competition is the way that it's phrased. So Rover had this very intense competition with dog vacay, where they just clobbered each other. They kept reducing fees, spending money on ads, and just going broke, attacking each other. And eventually they merged. And his takeaway is we should have either done that a lot earlier or tried to beat them a lot quicker and not kind of let them hang around.
Could have been the same story of Uber and Lyft.
Yeah.
I wonder why they... Apparently, from what I've heard, Uber never really seriously considered it, but could be wrong. And it sounds like it could have been the same story had they combined earlier or combined at all. Yeah.
Easy in hindsight.
Mm-hmm.
And the next one is a little bit similar. It's expand into new business lines sooner. So this again is a Rover. So Rover started as a dog sitting service, and they always had this. They knew, hey, we should get into dog walking. That's a very similar business. Same people are using it, and they waited way too long. And from the research I got of getting into that, and basically it allowed for WAG to launch.
Mm-hmm.
And turns out that's a much better business is the dog walking business than the dog sitting business, because it's more frequent. And so they wish they actually just did that.
It's kind of a lesson from the Thumbtack example of one, expanding into other verticals, but two, doing it with the North Star being frequency.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, but it's tricky. Like being at Airbnb, coming in around a time where everybody was telling them you should get into Airbnb for boats,
parking spaces, boats. Yeah.
For dogs. And there's this. I think it was really important that the decision they made is no. There's actually so much to do in just Airbnb for travel, which led to this whole Snow White initiative, where they mapped out each step of the journey of a traveler to understand that there's so many steps along that journey that could be better. And that helped them realize there's so much more to do. Let's not distract ourselves. So it's almost a counterexample. You shouldn't necessarily
expand too early.
Yeah. So
right. And experiences was 10 years in.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't think it's hard to know exactly when it's the right time and not the right time. But I think this is a good example of sometimes you should just do it. And I think one key attribute of this is they realize it's the exact same demand base. And so it wasn't actually that different.
Right.
And they could have probably just done it.
Man, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I really like what they would have done differently. That list, as in addition to the prescriptive things of what the data said and the research said they did well.
Yeah.
Okay, is there anything else to share before we part? And the obvious thing is for folks to read the post to get all of the nuggets of information. And I was joking about how dense it is. It's a 30-minute read. It's very enlightening. Well, maybe 45 an hour, but it's a really, really enlightening post. And it's something that I think, like we said at the top of this conversation, it's so valuable for someone to have done, because it's for how much marketplaces are talked about, they're wildly still under discussed.
Especially, I think, the breadth. I think there's a lot of dives into one marketplace at a time.
Right.
And so I think what got me excited about this is just what works across all of these folks. And I think as this comes out, I'll probably learn a ton more, probably correct some of the stuff and then add to it. So I'm excited just about where this is going to go. And that
So am I. Well, is there anything else to add? Where can people find you online?
At Lenny San on Twitter. And then I have this newsletter that I've been experimenting with, which is just my name.com, LennyRachitsky.com, which may be hard to spell. So you could just go to lenny.substack.com as well. That's where I'm at.
All right, Leonard. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, not just for this conversation, but more importantly, for the countless hours put into this research. Thank you so much. It's something that's might not be fascinating to the entirety of the startup ecosystem, but for the right people, this is about as good of a deep dive into a pretty hip space as I've ever seen. So thank you.
Thanks, James. Let's get some artichokes.
Let's do it. Hey, friends and listeners, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to hear more of these types of conversations, go over to your favorite podcast app and hit subscribe. or leave us a review, good or bad. We love hearing from people that appreciate this type of conversation and want more of it. You can also follow us on Twitter at @GoBelowTheLine, as well as see in our Twitter bio our email address for you to shoot us a note on any suggestions of guests or topics that we should cover. We read every single one, so thank you for those that have already sent those in. That's it for us today. We will see you next time on Below the Line.
Below the Line is brought to you by Straight Up Podcasts.